My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and not too long ago I was listening to Corey Olsen, or the Tolkien Professor, in his Exploring Lord of the Rings series, and they were talking about the colors of the wizards, and he mentioned the fact that he doesn't really think the colors are so much a rank thing as a job assignment type thing. And this made a lot of sense to me, and I'll get into the reasons why in a minute. And they talked a little bit about what those roles might be, but they didn't really come up with good, clear examples for all the wizards. So in this video, what I want to do is give my theory as to what all the different colors of the various wizards actually mean, and explain why I think that's the case. So let's see if we can come up with a good, coherent theory for that. So to start off, the reason he thinks that it's not really rank related and not and more like a job assignment type thing is, for one thing, you've got two blue wizards, and why should they be, necessarily the same rank? And also, it's really hard to see how you would rank the other wizards anyway. Saruman is the head of the council, of course, but that comes later. That's not an inherent thing. The council is formed long after the wizards arrive in Middle-earth, and he is chosen as the head of the council. And it tells us, actually, that Galadriel wanted Gandalf to be the head of the council. Presumably they already had their color assignments, and so it doesn't really seem to make any sense that the colors have anything to do with their rank. It has probably more to do with their job assignments. So what exactly would those job assignments be? Well, one of the easiest ones to pick out is in fact Saruman. And being the white, his job is to oppose black, i.e. Sauron. And we can see this pretty directly, but you might be wondering, well, aren't they all opposing Sauron? Yes, but Saruman's job is the most directly involved with defeating the enemy. And the reason you can tell this is so is because Saruman is the one who has studied the rings, the devices of the enemy, and he's the one who has come up with his own devices and things that have helped the White Council defeat the enemy in the past. Gandalf himself says so at the Council of Elrond. So the White Wizard seems to be the one who is most directly involved with opposing the enemy in a way that might directly defeat the enemy. And this plays through whenever Gandalf comes back as Gandalf the White, and he's no longer the Gray. His role is much more directly aimed at opposing the enemy in the open and doing things that are really directly focused in that direction than when he was Gandalf the Gray. And so I think that fits, and it shows that Gandalf's change to the White Wizard is not so much a promotion as it is a, okay, Saruman ditched his old job, we're filling his job with you now. So you go back and you do Saruman's job. And as Gandalf tells Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli when he meets them in Fangorn Forest after being reborn, or reincarnated rather, he tells them, I am Saruman, or rather Saruman as he should have been. He is not like, he's not kicking Saruman out of his place so much, he's just replacing him in the sense that, we no longer have anybody filling that role, so I had to do it. So that's the White Wizard's job. Now let's take a look at some of the others. Radagast the Brown is another one that's pretty easy to peg, and it just seems kind of natural that the wizard who is most friendly with birds and beasts and who is really good at changing hues and is kind of in tune with the earth would be brown. That seems kind of fitting. And, ignore the Hobbit movies, because the Hobbit movies, Radagast is kind of a joke in the Hobbit movies, and that's about all he is in the Hobbit movies. In the books, we don't really know much of anything about Radagast, but we do get the idea from Gandalf that he is a perfectly worthy wizard. We don't really know what he gets up to for the most part. In a letter much later, Tolkien will end up saying that all the wizards except Gandalf probably failed in their mission, although that's not really a static concept because his ideas of that changed, and we'll get to that a little bit more when we talk about the blue wizards. But you get this idea that Tolkien considered Radagast kind of a failure in that he didn't really do a lot. that doesn't mean he didn't do anything from the time he arrived to the time he, of the War of the Ring. So, what was Radagast doing? Well, we get some idea in The Lord of the Rings because the main interaction that he gets with the story is he meets Gandalf when he is at the southern borders of the Shire trying to get news right before he goes to Isengard at Radagast's, word, because Radagast tells him, Saruman sent me to find you, tell you that you've got to get down there in a hurry because he knows that the Nine are abroad, and if you want help, you need to go get it now. So what Gandalf tells him is, so, okay, I'll go, but don't rush off yet. Send any messages of any news that you get or whatever to Isengard. Tell all your bird and beast friends to send messages that way. And that's why Gwahir the Wind Lord, the Great Eagle, ends up coming to Isengard and picking Gandalf up off the pinnacle of Orthanc. So Radagast certainly has a friendship with the other, the Great Eagles at a minimum, which is kind of a big deal because what little we do know about the Eagles is they don't tend to get directly involved with a lot of people and their doings, and yet Radagast seems to be one of the few people who has like direct lines of communication, or at least indirect lines of communication to the Eagles, and that's a big deal. So what Radagast does for most of the story and most of the history of the Third Age, it's not really clear, but certainly it seems that he could be at least using birds and beasts as messengers, spies, that kind of thing, and also, learning things about maybe Sauron indirectly through things that he does to the earth and whatnot. So hard to say exactly, but the color scheme at least does seem to fit, with brown being connected to his job. So the last two we have are the blue wizards and then of course Gandalf. And there's two blue wizards, and this is interesting partially because when the story began, there were no two blue wizards. That idea didn't even exist until he came up with it much later. And indeed, the idea that there were five wizards didn't exist until Saruman tells Gandalf from the top of Orthanc, well, not the top, but he tells Gandalf, are you here to, are you going to let me go whenever you have the keys of Barad-dûr and the rods of the five wizards and etc. So it's only at that point that the idea of five wizards being a concrete thing really arises. And then it's only later that we get the designation of them being blue. That comes up in the Unfinished Tales stuff and further, writings of that nature. We don't really learn anything about them in The Lord of the Rings at all. And the interesting thing about that is, he doesn't have a color scheme for them whenever he writes any of these lines, and so it's not really clear that he had any particular role in mind. But when he finally does write them into a role, their role seems to be primarily going into the east and somehow or other undermining Sauron, like maybe by seemingly, at least in some conceptions of his idea what they were doing, they were actively fomenting rebellion, or at least getting people in the east to not side with Sauron, which was kind of his main base of support. In the west, you have the remainder of the High Elves, you have other elves that have never wanted to be under the dominion of, the Dark Lord, whether Morgoth or Sauron. You've got the descendants of Numenor, and you've got men who are pretty closely connected with the Edain, who were in Beleriand in the First Age. So those are all natural enemies of Sauron. The East has always been where there's the least knowledge of, the Valar and anything that goes on, across the sea, and therefore that's a little bit easier to control the people in the East and easier to delude them or dominate them. And so that's where Sauron's, main support as far as men comes from. So the blue wizards are out there basically trying to undermine Sauron's ability to build up huge forces. And the reason I think they're the blue wizards, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky because it's not clear, of course, that Tolkien had a clear idea of what these colors meant and how they applied to the job roles. So this is really speculation. But my suspicion is if he had an idea of what their job role was and gave them a color on those grounds, Blue, especially very dark blue, can be mistaken for black, or it could be like the shadow of black, you might say. So a really, really dark blue, a really deep navy blue can be mistaken for black, or, you know, a shadow of something really dark that's not quite, it's not as dark as the thing itself. If there's enough light around it, can be bluish. And even sometimes, weirdly, black things can give off like a bluish tint if the light hits it just right too. So it almost gives me the idea that they're blue wizards because they are kind of pretending almost in a sense to be black so that they can start the rebellion against black. They're infiltrators. They are spies and, fomenters of rebellion. So they're in black's territory, but they're still not black themselves. And so I think that's probably the best explanation of what the blue wizards as blue means. Now, here again, this is another area where Tolkien kind of changed his conception about the wizards. His original writings on the Blue Wizards more or less indicates that they probably failed in their mission. And then he has later writings that come along, and these I think were published in The Peoples of Middle-earth, which is the 12th volume of the History of Middle-earth series by Christopher Tolkien. These later writings, which Christopher had access to earlier on, but couldn't decipher them because J.R.R. Tolkien's handwriting was just so hard to read, but he did have them. He eventually figured out more or less what they said, and so he finally publishes them later on. And in this later conception, it would seem that Tolkien kind of changed his mind and said they did have some success, and if it had not been for what they achieved in the East, Sauron's victory would have been all but certain, and he would have crushed the West much quicker, and there wouldn't have been a chance to destroy the ring. So, Tolkien is changing his ideas about these things all the time, and we don't really know what he finally decided on, but they're blue wizards. That's the one thing we do get pretty consistently through all of his writings, to the extent that he talks about them at all. And this, I think, is where blue kind of fits in. So now finally we have Gandalf himself, the Grey Pilgrim. And the Tolkien professor in the Exploring the Lord of the Rings kind of tried to figure out like why gray. Didn't get a really firm conclusion on it, but I think I've got a pretty good idea of what gray means. Gray, and gray is interesting because gray is kind of a mix between black and white, and so it seems hard to peg exactly what that would be just intuitively. But what we know about Gandalf's role in terms of what he actually does for most of the story until he comes back as the White Wizard is that his job is to kind of stir up resistance against the enemy and do so mainly in the West. And by doing that, he's not getting directly involved in the fight most of the time. He is encouraging others. He is giving them courage, giving them inspiration and hope, and that sort of thing. So in this sense, I think his being gray is more like a background of white, and this more like a shadow of white in a sense. It's like he's the backup player to Saruman's lead guitar, you might say. He's the one that's making possible the direct attack or direct defense, one way or the other, by giving enough people the spiritual resources to put up that defense. Whereas Saruman is more interested in actually, coming up with the weapons, the plans, that sort of thing. Gandalf is the one who is kind of in the background, making sure that there are people to wield those weapons or implement those plans. And the other interesting thing about that too, because of his role, he is naturally a wanderer, and he goes around, pretty much all over Middle Earth doing this stuff. He even tells us at one point, well, he doesn't tell us directly, Faramir actually kind of tells us this, that he's got a name in the south, and he's got a name in the north, and he's got a name in, among the elves. So he's been to the south, and by the south, he almost has to mean Harad, because where else south would he be? South is, if you're not all the way in Harad, would be Gondor itself, and they're the ones that call him Mithrandir, but he's got a name in Kanus among, the south. So he's been all kinds of places. But the one place he doesn't go is the east, so he's not a blue wizard. So, but I think because of his wandering, and here we can actually pull in some quotes from other people to kind of substantiate this, his wandering kind of naturally fits the gray color as well, because it's kind of the color of a wandering itinerant beggar, or something like that, because his clothes are not going to be clean. They're going to be dirty. They're going to get gray and washed out. And we can connect this because we get, whenever he comes with the three hunters to Edoras to talk to Theoden, and also Wormtongue tells him, "You're the most beggar-like of the four." And he mentions, the fact that he's dressed in gray gets mentioned several times. He is, at this point, cloaking himself in gray to disguise the fact that he is now the white, as opposed to previously he was actually just always dressed in gray. But Wormtongue picks up on the idea that you're dressed in gray and you look like a beggar. So again, I think that kind of fits with his role, being a wanderer who has no permanent home, who's constantly on the move, traveling. So I think that fits the gray theme, but I think primarily the reason he's a gray wizard is because he's kind of the background. He's in the background. He's got kind of a drab, nondescript color. He's not actively out there opposing the enemy in the open, but he is doing it, and so he's kind of like white, but a little bit diluted, and a little bit, not diluted in a bad way, but like diluted in the sense that he's not the pure white, in that Saruman is the one who's directly fighting the enemy, or at least coming up with means to fight the enemy. Gandalf is the one in the background making sure everybody's ready to fight the enemy. So that's where I think the gray comes in, but it also fits his natural wandering position. So that's my theory on what the colors of the wizards mean and represent as far as their roles in Middle-earth. Do you have your own theory on what they mean? And if you do, please leave it in the comments below. We might get some really interesting conversation going on this topic, so it could be really fun. If you want to follow me over on Twitter, you can do that at JRRTLore, and I occasionally drop some Tolkien-related trivia questions. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that bell icon. You can also find me on Rumble now, and support me over at Patreon. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.